Amelia Earhart. On July 2, 1937, Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan climbed into a Lockheed Electra and flew into the Pacific Ocean and never came back. She was 39 years old and 22,000 miles into a 29,000-mile attempt to circumnavigate the globe, the kind of flight no woman had ever completed. The plan was to refuel at Howland Island, a 2-mile strip of land sitting alone in the middle of the Pacific. Visibility was poor. Radio contact between Earhart's plane and the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was garbled and fragmentary from the start. At 8:43 in the morning, she sent her final message, "We are on the line 157337. Then nothing. The most expensive air and sea search in American history up to that point found no wreckage, no bodies, no evidence of any kind. She was declared legally dead 18 months later. Researchers and investigators have spent nearly 90 years arguing over what happened. The most straightforward explanation is fuel exhaustion, followed by a crash into open ocean. A second theory places her on Nikumaroro, an uninhabited atoll 350 nautical miles south of Howland Island, where bones and artifacts have been recovered, but never conclusively identified as hers. A third theory, largely circumstantial, involves Japanese military activity in the region. None of it has ever been proven. As recently as late 2025, a research team from Purdue University was preparing to examine an unidentified underwater object near Nikumaroro using magnetometers and sonar. The wreckage of the Electra has never been recovered. Whatever happened in those final hours over the Pacific, the ocean has kept the answer entirely to itself. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur at 12:41 in the morning, carrying 227 passengers and 12 crew members bound for Beijing. 38 minutes after takeoff, the crew made their last routine contact with air traffic control over the South China Sea. Minutes later, the plane disappeared from secondary radar. What nobody knew yet was that Malaysian military primary radar was still tracking it, and it had turned sharply west. The Boeing 777 crossed back over the Malay Peninsula, flew northwest across the Andaman Sea, and vanished entirely from radar at 2:22 in the morning, 200 nautical miles northwest of Penang. Satellite data later confirmed the aircraft flew on for another 6 hours, eventually banking south into the most remote stretch of the southern Indian Ocean. The multinational search that followed became the most expensive aviation search in history and found almost nothing. In 2015, a section of the plane's flaperon washed ashore on Reunion Island and was confirmed as debris from MH370. The aircraft itself has never been found. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah had, in the weeks before the flight, run a simulation on his home flight simulator, tracing a route that closely matched the aircraft's final southward path. Whether that represents premeditation or coincidence, no investigator has been able to establish. A new search conducted by the marine robotics company Ocean Infinity between March 2025 and January 2026 surveyed thousands of square kilometers of ocean floor under a no-find, no-fee contract worth $70 million. No wreckage was located. All 239 people aboard remain presumed dead. D.B. Cooper. On the evening of November 24, 1971, a man who called himself Dan Cooper passed a note to a flight attendant on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 during a short hop from Portland to Seattle. The note said he had a bomb. He opened his briefcase and showed her what appeared to be one. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. When the plane landed in Seattle, he released the 36 passengers in exchange for the money and parachutes, then ordered the crew to fly south toward Mexico City at low altitude. Somewhere over southwestern Washington, at around 10,000 feet in the dark and rain, he strapped on a parachute, clipped the ransom to his body, and jumped out the rear staircase of the plane. He was never seen again. In 1980, a boy digging along the column Aya River near Vancouver, Washington uncovered $5,800 in deteriorated $20 bills matching the serial numbers from the ransom. The location didn't align with any of the FBI's calculated drop zones and raised more questions than it answered. The FBI investigated for 45 years, assembled the largest single suspect file in the agency's history, and officially suspended active investigation in 2016 without ever identifying the man. Whether he survived the jump into that November forest has never been determined. His real name remains unknown. The mechanical locking device the FAA subsequently mandated for rear aircraft staircases is still called the Cooper Vane, the Lost Colony of Roanoke. In 1587, English Governor John White led 115 settlers to Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They were attempting to establish England's first permanent settlement in the Americas, and from the beginning the colony was struggling badly. White sailed back to England for emergency supplies within weeks of arrival. The war with Spain and the Spanish Armada delayed his return by 3 years. When he finally landed on Roanoke in August of 1590, the settlement was completely empty. Houses had been dismantled and removed. The stockade had been taken down. Every single person was gone without visible sign of violence or panic. The only trace left behind was a single word carved into a fence post: Croatoan. The letters CRO were cut into a nearby tree. Croatoan was the name of both an indigenous people and a nearby island. Before leaving, White had instructed the colonists to carve a cross, into a tree if they abandoned the settlement under duress. There was no cross. He never found the colonists. No definitive explanation has emerged in more than 4 centuries of investigation. Archaeological excavations on Hatteras Island and surrounding areas have produced fragments of English pottery and iron tools, but nothing that explains what became of those 115 people. Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa built the Teamsters into the most powerful labor union in the United States, served a federal prison sentence for jury tampering and fraud, and walked out in 1971 with ambitions to reclaim the organization that organized crime had spent years using as its own financial instrument. On July 30th, 1975, the 62-year-old former Union president drove to the Machis Red Fox restaurant in suburban Detroit for a meeting he believed was arranged with 2 mob-connected figures. He telephoned his wife from a payphone outside the restaurant at 2:30 that afternoon, told her the men he was waiting for were late. That call is the last confirmed contact anyone ever had with James Riddle Hoffa. He never entered the restaurant. No witness saw him leave the parking lot. No body was recovered, and no crime scene was ever identified. Federal investigators pursued the case for decades and developed theories placing his remains beneath a Michigan driveway, inside a New Jersey landfill, and in several other locations. Every dig produced nothing. He was legally declared presumed dead in 1982. The FBI's working theory has remained for years that Hoffa was killed by organized crime figures threatened by his return to power. Nobody was ever charged. What happened in that parking lot on a Wednesday afternoon in July of 1975 has never been established.